cocaine became the top earner in the illicit drug economy. In 1979, smugglers moved an estimated 25 to 31 metric tons into the United States. The leaf came mostly from Bolivia and Peru. The chemistry happened mainly in Colombia, about 70% of the conversion to cocaine hydrochloride. Florida was the front door, roughly 40% of US-bound loads, most of it carried by air passenger couriers. No single ethnic group had a monopoly. The trade was sophisticated and decentralized, independents, white-collar dabblers, and full-time criminal networks operating side by side. Mafia-type outfits were in the picture, more at the smuggling and wholesale tiers than the street. The trend line pointed up as a youth market widened. Price, not scarcity, kept some users from daily habits. For law enforcement, the outlook was bleak. Coca thrives on Andean slopes, at 1,500 to 7,000 feet. Farmers first harvest at 2 to 3 years and can pull leaves 2 to 6 times a year for as long as 40 years. The conversion is basic chemistry. Pick leaves, soak with kerosene, caustic soda, water, and other agents to make coca paste. Then refine paste into cocaine hydrochloride. It takes about 500 kilograms of leaf to yield 1 kilogram of cocaine. Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia are the key producers. Peru and Bolivia account for up to 90% of global leaf. Bolivian fields line the eastern Andes in North and South Yungas and Chapare. In Peru, production sits in the high jungle on the eastern slopes. In the Andes, coca is culture. The Incas treated it as a living manifestation of divinity. To this day, an estimated 90% of men and 20% of women in the eastern watershed chew leaves daily for hunger, fatigue, and aches. Peru and Bolivia are the only licit producers, each with roughly 25,000 to 30,000 hectares, 9 times what legal markets would require. In Bolivia alone, as much as 80% of the annual 33,000 to 39,000 tons of leaf flows illicit. Nearly all US cocaine comes out of Peruvian and Bolivian leaf. Colombia is the hub. Between 50 and 70% of the cocaine reaching the US passes through or is refined there. Florida takes about 40% of the inbound traffic. Product lands at 90 to 95% purity. By the time it hits a glass coffee table, it's been cut with lactose, amphetamines, or procaine down to 10 to 20%. Average street purity hovers around 12%. Users swallow, inject, snort, or smoke. Snorting dominates. Cocaine isn't traditionally classed as physically addicting, but since 1974 reported cocaine injuries have tripled. Psychological dependence shows up case after case. Coca came west with the Spanish and sat mostly ignored until the mid-19th century. German chemists isolated cocaine in 1860. Between 1884 and 1906, American entrepreneurs marketed it hard. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Harrison Act killed legal sales. By the 1930s, illegal use was niche. Jasmine, movie stars, the rich. By the mid-1970s, cocaine was the recreational drug of choice for millions of solid, conventional, often upwardly mobile users. In 1976, estimates put lifetime users between 4 and 7 million. Today's numbers push 10 to 15 million who've tried it. Within that, roughly 10% use daily and about 70% use at least twice a month. DEA says 25 to 31 metric tons enter the US annually, all from South America. Other estimates go higher, into the mid-40s. Officials admit they interdict only 5 to 10%. On the street, an ounce runs $1,400 to $2,500 depending on quality. Figure $2,200 on average, about 5 times the price of gold in that era. A typical evening's 150 milligrams costs $15 to $25. The price climbs in predictable steps. Farmer, 500 kilos of leaves sell for about $250. Paste. Those leaves become 2.5 kilos of Coca paste, worth $3,000 to $5,000. Base. Paste is refined to a kilo of base, sold for $8,000 to $11,000. Crystal. Base becomes a kilo of cocaine hydrochloride, $15,000 to $20,000 to a US buyer. Coast. On the US East Coast, that kilo nets $38,000 to $40,000. Wholesalers cut to 50% strength and move it for $76,000 to $80,000. Diluted down to 12% for retail, the same kilo's worth roughly $80,000 in gram sales. The margins and broad social acceptance drew a full cast: part-timers, professionals, and sophisticated criminal organizations. Almost anyone who buys can flip to dealing, cut a portion, sell enough to cover your own use, plus profit. Young professionals were padding incomes by $10,000 to $20,000 a year this way. Hard counts are impossible, but cases show scale. Illinois police once arrested 5 women and 3 men with $2.5 million in product. They weren't a formal ring, just a social orbit of individual sellers moving weight to anyone with cash. Sometimes a bold independent tapped the source. A Chicago dealer flew to Colombia, bought $3,000 worth, split it into 18-gram increments, stuffed 47 envelopes, mailed them home, and cleared $25,000. Bigger outfits recruited from everywhere: athletes, brokers, pilots. James Joseph Boyle Jr. was the template. He left Oklahoma State, needed money, and in August 1972 flew to Santiago, Chile, and bought 5 kilos for $10,000. Back in California, he flipped them for a $40,000 profit. Within a year, he'd spread to Kansas City, Los Angeles, and Dallas. By his September 1973 arrest, his group had smuggled more than 50 kilos. It made money, but lacked insulation. One arrest could roll the whole ladder. In the Southwest, independents stitched in Mexican suppliers. A 1977 Newsday run on Arizona listed 9 cocaine smuggling groups. 5 had no Mafia ties. The patterns: the Cooper organization, founded mid-70s. 13 aircraft shuttled cocaine and marijuana through airports in Wisconsin, Alaska, and Minnesota. Associates included Peter H. Schuer, Minnesota, and William M. Lechuga, Phoenix. The Renner organization, George F. Renner. The third led about 30 people, supplying Phoenix and Colorado with loads hidden in pickup campers and horse trailers. Members included Edward T. Gallegos and Ralph M. Chavez of Holbrook, Arizona. The Breen brothers, Gary and Stephen Breen, moved small, steady quantities from Mexico to Phoenix for a tight circle of buyers. The Lamb organization, William Vernon Lamb, supplied from Peru and Colombia to Denver, Las Vegas, and Bethesda, Maryland. John Price handled Phoenix links. The Bond organization, James C. Bond in Tucson, air-moved cocaine and marijuana to Newport Beach, Canada, Boston, and New York. Supplied by Rosenda Sanchez of Magdalena de Quino, Mexico. Associates included Edward Caballero Jr. and Glenn Donahue. Independence mattered, especially below the importer wholesaler level, but multi-kilo flow demanded bigger machines. Independents don't supply a nation. The large, regular shipments, multi-kilo, week after week, are run by well-organized traffickers in South America and the United States. Compared to heroin's heyday, cocaine's US market saw less penetration by traditional mafia at the street and mid-levels, but the business itself had to be organized. Only groups with cash, logistics, and discipline could line up steady supplies, transport, and distribution. And it wasn't one ethnicity. Smuggling and sales cut across Cuban, Colombian, Mexican, Italian, American, and 100 hybrid crews. No cartel held the monopoly that LCN once had over heroin in the 60s. The Cuban Revolution set the table. Under Batista, cocaine was a posh vice in Havana. After 1959, Cuban exiles rebuilt networks in Florida and linked up with Latin American sources. From 1965 to 1975, Cuban criminal organizations dominated Florida imports, drawing product from South America with Colombian intermediaries. Until the mid-60s, Colombian traffickers mostly supplied domestic demand and sold small amounts to Mexicans and Americans. As ties to US-based Cubans deepened, Colombians expanded output, produced their own cocaine from paste, and began pushing more to the US. By the early 70s, they weren't just producers. They were traffickers and distributors, showing up aggressively in South Florida, once a Cuban stronghold. By 1977 to 1978, Colombian groups cut reliance on non-Colombian distributors and went direct, seeking to dominate the US market. Arrest numbers tracked the push. Colombian nationals picked up in the US for drug offenses rose from 183 in 1976 to 432 in 1979. They didn't seize a monopoly and probably couldn't. The profits drew too many players. Demand outstripped any one group's ability to control the chain from bush to mirror. And as cultivation rose, access broadened. But Colombians remained the dominant force because geography. Peru sits on Colombia's southern border. Bolivia lies less than 600 miles farther. The US, the world's biggest market, is only about 1,100 miles away. Processing. Colombia became the principal refiner. It had better access to industrial chemicals and routes to market. In some rural districts, traffickers operated with near impunity, ideal lab country. Underworld capacity, a large, aggressive criminal subculture with the expertise to move product worldwide. Result, between 50 and 70% of US-bound cocaine passed through or was refined in Colombia. By the mid-70s, US authorities counted 60 to 80 major Colombian organizations, roughly half with 50 to 100 members and serious capital. Today's shape, 14 to 25 Mafia-style organizations led by padrinos, godfathers who used bribes and threats, bought legitimate businesses, and insulated themselves with specialists. DEA analysts called it quasi-industrial. 6 rules governing operations. Expertise, know the product end to end. Efficiency, tight links between source and market. Solvency, continuous cash flow and competent money handling. Discipline, cooperation with police equals death. Security, understand the police and their methods. Violence, use it when needed, without hesitation. Specialties covered procurement of paste/base, smuggling and stockpiling, clandestine lab work, deal-making, transportation and travel logistics, legal services, false IDs and documents, couriers, money movers, launderers. These organizations controlled up to 90% of cocaine traffic through Colombia and between 45 and 60% of the flow to the US. Even then, they earned less than a third of final profits. Much of the markup accrued to American criminal elements. One reason Colombians pushed deeper into US distribution. Benjamin Papa Negro Herrera Zuleta was one of the brains. His operation ran with about 92 members. The core included 7 brothers, 2 sisters, cousins, and in-laws. Chemist Carlos Alvarez oversaw multiple labs producing 40 to 120 kilos of 90% cocaine each month. From there, loads went to Emilio Herrera in Barranquilla, David Herrera in Medellin, and Carlos Herrera in Bogotá, then north, mostly Miami and New York. Couriers got $500 to $1,000 to carry 2 to 4 kilo packets into the US. The organization's monthly output generated $20 to $50 million on American streets. Miami led as the port of entry, followed by Los Angeles and San Juan. Boats used 3 routes, up through the Yucatan Channel between Mexico and Cuba, careful to stay clear of Cuban waters and draconian drug laws, or through the Mona Passage between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. From there, smugglers cut into the Gulf, hit either Florida coast, or ran up the eastern seaboard. Sea meant bigger loads, longer runs, and heavier penalties when caught. Air ruled. In 1977, an estimated 33% of U.S. shipments came by air. By 1979, estimates put it at 50 to 65%. Flying was faster, less exposed, and let organizations spread risk across many small loads. The bulk of smuggling involved sub-4 kilo parcels on commercial flights carried by mules. Recruits were easy to find in Colombia and expendable. One example, a Bogotá-Los Angeles passenger earned $10,000 carrying about a pound of cocaine, the size of a paperback. Brunif's Bogotá. A Flight 992 earned the nickname the Cocaine Special. Tactics evolved daily. A mule would stash the cocaine on board, clear customs in LA, reboard, and get off in San Francisco with the package. Others dissolved cocaine in liquor or perfume, soaked it into cotton clothing, and later recovered it with about a 10% loss. False bottom suitcases and molded suitcase liners hid kilos. Body cavities and taped packages under clothing moved smaller amounts. Airline crew mules, candy bars, toothpaste tubes, wigs, and double-stitched leather goods carried their share. On arrival, a domestic distributor scooped the courier. The riskiest leg was over. Private aircraft grew more common. Increasingly, the planes were US-owned, evidence of American capital buying direct from source. The cargo size and plane values pointed to well-financed crews. In June 1981, a twin-engine Cessna bust turned up 440 pounds, about $16 million street. On June 12, 1978, an air seizure on Grand Exuma in the Bahamas produced a load U.S. agents valued at $1.5 billion on the street. With the U.S. market maturing, South American groups widened their reach into Western Europe, feeding a fast-growing demand with direct shipments. Colombian organizations, with full chain control, from Andean supply to U.S. user, concentrated in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. They didn't own the market, but their leverage was strongest there. Outside those cities, domestic networks showed less Colombian control. Penetration was helped by large Colombian immigrant communities with ties back home. Miami, New York, and Los Angeles all had heavy concentrations. Miami stayed the top entry point, then LA, then New York. Jackson Heights, Queens shows the model. About 200,000 Colombians lived there. In the early 1970s, 6 Colombian gangs, roughly 1,000 people, built a cocaine pipeline in that neighborhood. The biggest was Alberto Bravo's, about 150 strong, moving up to $1.4 billion in cocaine in the early to mid-70s. In October 1974, 8 major dealers and 112 lesser figures were arrested. Drugs were seized in Manhattan, Queens, Miami, Los Angeles, Toronto, and San Antonio. New York alone was getting about £20 a week, $2.5 million at retail. Bravo fled to Colombia ahead of the sweep, but was later arrested in Florida, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years. His couriers wore custom vests that held 4 kilos and carried false bottom luggage. His supply originated in Medellin. The 200-member supplier network remained intact after the bust. Even as Colombians moved into areas Cubans once dominated, Cuban organizations remained heavy players in South Florida and New York. Colombians often supplied them. In 1975, the New York Times reported that 4 groups controlled much of New York's cocaine, import and distribution: Gustavo Restrepo, Ramon Matos, Lilia Parada, and Hugo Curbelo, 2 Cuban, 2 Colombian. Another primarily Colombian ring, with Cuban participation, moved hundreds of kilos into the U.S., mainly for New York distribution. Convictions followed in 1977. The structure was multi-layered importers at the top, couriers shuttling in and out. Concealment methods included false bottom shoes and suitcases, hollow coat hangers, and double-lined underwear and girdles. In New York, wholesale moved in kilo lots through rings centered in Latin neighborhoods: Jackson Heights, the South Bronx, Washington Heights, Union City. Ounce buyers, often small-time resellers, shopped bars and restaurants where Latin wholesalers operated. Mexico's role as a corridor declined. A 1977 Newsday piece called Mexico the Dispatching Center of Latin American Cocaine, but a GAO study the same year pegged it at about a third of U.S. supply. Current DEA estimates dropped that to 25%, about 4 to 6 tons annually. 3 reasons. Mexico's mid-70s enforcement pushed marijuana pipelines toward Colombia, disrupting Mexican outfits that moved both weed and coke. Colombians started shipping directly to the U.S., and Florida's proximity and ease made it the preferred entry. Still, Mexican organizations remained significant. Many smuggled cocaine alongside heroin. The constant legal commerce at the border, 157 million legal crossings in 1975, gave cover. Mules carried small amounts. Private aircraft flew larger loads. Jesus Manuel Araujo Avala's network, based in Los Angeles, supplied cities from Seattle and LA to New York and Pittsburgh with heroin and cocaine. Seizures totaled 93 pounds of cocaine. 23 members indicted in August 1979. Jesus Camacho, a DEA fugitive who ran a large smuggling operation out of Nogales, Mexico, used prostitutes as couriers. Associates included René Gaveño, Jorge Diaz, and Albert Núñez. Sergio Ramirez Alarcón, also Nogales-based, moving heroin and cocaine, allied with Johnny Grant Gomez, a major heroin dealer supplying as far as Washington, D.C. Hector Ambriz, DEA fugitive who ran a family network out of Nogales. Members included Cruz Venegas Ambriz, Jaime Ambriz, and Julio Romero Sanchez Ambriz. 2 prison-born Mexican-American organizations, La Nuestra Familia and the Mexican Mafia, also worked narcotics in the Southwest. La Nuestra Familia, NF, had roughly 250 to 1,000 members on the West Coast, structured with a Nuestra General, captains, lieutenants, and soldiers, reaching into Arizona and New Mexico. The Mexican Mafia, La EME, was looser, General Chuck Godfather on top, then captains and lieutenants. Exact roles in the cocaine economy are murky, but given West Coast demand, both had hands in distribution. Traditional LCN groups had lighter penetration in the West's narcotics scene. With a porous border and a culture of entrepreneurial smuggling, independents and regional syndicates dominated the cocaine lanes out of Mexico. From Andean fields to Miami runways, from lab glass in Medellin to ounce deals in Jackson Heights, the cocaine economy ran on speed, cash flow, and compartmentalization. Usage rose fast, injuries climbed, seizures nicked a fraction. The business spread across cultures, Colombian padrinos building industrial-scale supply, Cuban crews running legacy lanes, Mexican networks bridging the desert, independents filling every gap. Price did what handcuffs couldn't. It kept some users from daily habits. Everything else, profits, demand, and routes, kept growing. They called it the Israeli Mafia, 40 to 250 people, mostly Israeli citizens, working out of Los Angeles. The numbers moved around. The business didn't. They focused on narcotics, especially cocaine. One estimate put them at half the LA market. With Colombian crews all over Southern California, that figure is almost certainly high. What is clear? They exploited Los Angeles's loose, uncoordinated criminal landscape and built something worth up to $100 million. Supply lines ran east and south. Loads came in from Miami by commercial flights and out of Mexico City across the border, overland or in private planes. They also worked with La Cosa Nostra. In L.A., cooperation was practical. David Bakisian, Ari Bakisian, and Raphael Ben Seaman, reputed members, showed documented ties to LCN. The two camps did business when it made sense. Latin America was in the cocaine business country by country, but Bolivia's rise stood out. In 1979, traffickers there earned an estimated $500 million. At least 50 new millionaires emerged, some passed $30 million. Santa Cruz became the cocaine capital and a stronghold for the right-wing groups that helped General Luis Garcia Meza push aside interim President Lidia Guayla on July 17, 1980. Guayla's government had cracked down on trafficking. In return, drug money financed and armed military men with political ambitions. Bolivians called it what it was: the cocaine coup. Washington cut off narcotics cooperation that year after confirming financial ties between the new junta and big traffickers. Rudy Landivar, a right-wing coalition leader, was named as a key player. The allegation followed. The government itself was in the trade. Bolivians weren't running US street sales. Their role was upstream. Product moved through Colombia or Mexico. Some loads jumped direct to the west coast. That suggests organized groups bought in Bolivia and handled the transportation chain. If so, US traffickers could bypass Colombia entirely and build straight lines from La Paz to Los Angeles. One snapshot of the money. In May 1980, Alfredo Gutierrez, a Bolivian, was arrested on a $9 million down payment for a cocaine deal, DEA, valued at $200 million. He forfeited $100,000 bail and vanished. There's no single ledger that shows the exact degree of La Cosa Nostra's involvement in cocaine. The pieces we do have point to a real presence. At least 17 families and 117 known LCN figures were active in Florida, where about 40% of the nation's cocaine enters. That alone suggests opportunity. There's no proof of an LCN-run pipeline from South America, but their established marijuana channels indicate capacity. In Colombia, federal agents posing as LCN leaders were quickly treated as legitimate multi-kilo buyers. That acceptance implies Colombians believed LCN could move weight to the US. LCN has the cash, the logistics, and the people. Even so, the pattern shows them buying after Latino groups, primarily Colombians, get the cocaine into the country. With 26 families and as many as 50,000 Confederates, LCN already has the distribution network. The importer/wholesaler tier is where profits sit. A US importer pays roughly $38,000 to $40,000 per kilo. After cutting, retail value on that kilo can be quoted as high as $800,000. Writers who track the trade say the lion's share of the final profit lands with the American underworld. LCN figures prominently in that take. Alliances. LCN has worked with Latin organizations, Colombian, Cuban, Mexican, especially in South Florida, and with Mexican groups in the West. The market's big enough that these crews often coexist, sometimes peacefully. Takeovers. In some states, LCN took over existing distribution outfits, usually independents rather than entrenched Cuban or Colombian networks, which are too powerful and too close to source. If LCN locked in an alternate supply, say in Bolivia, they could challenge Colombian dominance, buying in. In other places, they muscled into the market by purchasing large blocks of cocaine and freezing out independents. That centralizes power at the import level. Independents either fold or get absorbed. Colombians pushing for tighter control of US distribution adds to that squeeze. Two cases show how it worked. Richard Crivero. From the late 60s until 1975, Crivero ran one of South Florida's biggest marijuana and cocaine operations. about 150 people. His suppliers were a Colombia-based group that included Otto Archibald, Alberto Ramirez, and Adolfo Gomez. Big ships carried the loads up. Smaller boats took them off Miami. Most landings were at Card Sound in Monroe County. From there, product moved up the Atlantic coast, into the Midwest, and down south. Crevero never became a made man, but his outfit owed allegiance to the Gambino family. He spent time with Ralph Broccoli, a Gambino soldier, and took money from Charles Gambino to finance buys. The points are simple. LCN has been in the cocaine business since at least the late 60s. South Florida is the hub. They finance large purchases and rely on Colombian suppliers to move freight to U.S. shores. Peter Licavoli Jr., the son of Detroit boss Peter Licavoli, ran an Arizona branch of the Zerilli Licavoli family. From Tucson, he moved cocaine and heroin to St. Louis, Detroit, Youngstown, Anaheim, and Boston. The lessons are similar. LCN groups outside Florida buy from Mexico when Mexican organizations supply. Western LCN crews turn to importing as a revenue stream, and they profit by feeding supplies into established national channels. DEA's stated goal was to stem the South American flow. The reality, only 5 to 10% of US cocaine is seized. Smugglers move in small parcels and keep changing methods. The numbers tell the story. DEA seizures, pounds. 1972 to 1979, combined domestic and foreign climbed from 688 to 13,255. Customs seizures, 1977 to 1980. The number of cases ran 1,025 to 846 to 1,459 to 1,307. Quantity 925 pounds to 1,419 pounds to 1,438 pounds to 4,743 pounds. Estimated street value, $246 million to $380 million to $424 million to $1.53 billion. The average customs seizure size grew from under a pound in 1977 to 3.62 pounds by 1980. Coast Guard. Minimal cocaine captures through the late 70s. Traffickers out equipped the cops. Better intel, faster boats and planes, newer radios. Agents had to speak in code on their own frequencies because traffickers monitored them. In court, simple possession often drew light treatment. Couriers averaged 2 to 3 years, about 24 months for women, 36 for men. Swapping out mules didn't slow the river. Interdiction alone won't do it. Hitting the source means eradication, crop substitution, and real economic development, especially in Peru and Bolivia, where coca leaf production drives the pipeline. Peru tried a limited eradication program in 1979 under US pressure. By most accounts, it failed, though Washington keeps courting cooperation. Bolivia registered coca land in 1977 to cap excess production, but foreign demand drove expansion anyway. Fields spread so fast that feeding an already undernourished country became a concern. With the junta's trafficking ties, US hopes for Bolivian cooperation went dark. Even if Peru and Bolivia stopped, coca could grow elsewhere: Java, Madagascar, British Guiana, Ceylon. It's not just economics, it's culture. In 1964, Henry Giordano, former US narcotics chief, told Congress that Andean Indians would have to be converted from chewing coca to normal diets if coca growing were to end. That's the problem in a sentence. In the Andes, coca leaf is aspirin and chewing gum. On the same terraces that grow bananas, citrus, coffee, and vegetables, coca is daily life. You don't outlaw tobacco in America without a war. You don't rip out coca in the Andes without a plan. Substituting crops and incomes beats burning fields. Colombia is a pressure point. Most South American cocaine passes through it. Every kilo seized there stops about 8 kilos of cut cocaine from hitting US streets. There have been hits. In 1975, Operation Kitchen, a joint DEA Colombia move, shut 7 labs and seized a ton. On September 10, 1978, raids on 3 labs netted 800 kilos, valued at $400 million on the street, roughly twice Colombia's national budget at the time. But the lesson kept repeating: seizures hurt, not halt. In 1968, Americans spent around $100 million on marijuana. By 1979, DEA estimated US retail sales at $15 to $22 billion. Time put it near $24 billion. About 43 million Americans had smoked marijuana. At least 15 million were regular users. In 1970, only 12 million had tried it, with about 3 million regulars. Use among adults 18 and older kept rising even as youth use, ages 12 to 17, leveled off. Marijuana sits as the number 2 illegal earner behind cocaine. In 1979, an estimated 9,300 to 12,600 metric tons were imported into the US. Colombia accounted for roughly 75%. Illegal crops in Hawaii and California were small and scattered. Mexico, Colombia, and the Caribbean supplied most shipments. Florida was the main gateway, about 30%, with product arriving largely by boat. Like cocaine, the marijuana trade is sophisticated and decentralized. No one ethnic group owns it. Mafia-type organizations show up in smuggling and distribution, but they don't run the whole board. Use will likely stay high, though total consumption may dip as the youth population shrinks and teen rates stabilize. Demand for higher potency product gives a boost to domestic growers. Law enforcement's prospects for rolling it back are slim. In 1968, Americans spent roughly $100 million on marijuana. A decade later, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, estimated the annual retail value of the US marijuana trade between $15 and $22 billion. Time magazine placed it even higher, at $24 billion. An estimated 43 million Americans had smoked marijuana by then, with at least 15 million regular users, numbers that had soared from 1970, when only 12 million had tried it, and 3 million were regular smokers. Use among adults 18 and older kept rising, even as youth use leveled off. Marijuana had become the second largest source of illicit drug revenue in the United States, behind only cocaine. Of the 9,300 to 12,600 metric tons imported into the country in 1979, roughly 75% came from Colombia. Illegal domestic production in places like Hawaii and California remained small and scattered. Most shipments came through Mexico, Colombia, and the Caribbean, with Florida serving as the primary entry point, about 30% of all imports, most arriving by sea. The trade was sophisticated but decentralized. No single ethnic group monopolized it, but organized crime participation, particularly Mafia-type syndicates, was becoming more visible in both smuggling and distribution. And while total consumption might decline slightly among teenagers as that population shrank and their usage plateaued, marijuana use was likely to remain widespread. A preference for higher potency product would spur the growth of a domestic industry. Law enforcement, meanwhile, faced bleak odds of significantly curtailing the trade. Marijuana is a special type of hemp, a plant historically prized for cordage and sales. Cultivated as early as 5,000 to 10,000 years ago in Central Asia, hemp was part of human life long before it became an intoxicant. Greek historian Herodotus recorded its use in 450 BC. But smoking marijuana didn't become popular in the Western Hemisphere until the 18th century, when African slaves introduced it to Brazil. Hemp itself had crossed the Atlantic even earlier. Planted in Virginia, in 1611 to supply Britain's navy with sails and ropes. The plant's botanical name is Cannabis sativa. It thrives in the same soil and climate as corn, requiring water, light and nitrogen-rich soil, and matures in 90 to 120 days, growing anywhere from 1 to 20 feet tall. Its dark green leaves, up to 3 inches wide and 7 inches long, are dried, crushed, and smoked. The psychoactive ingredient delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, varies widely. Colombian marijuana, with a THC content of 6 to 10%, is among the most potent. Most domestic US marijuana contains only 0.2 to 2%. While moderate marijuana use poses fewer health risks in the short term than heavy alcohol or tobacco use, it can still damage the lungs and impair activities requiring precise timing and judgment, such as driving or operating machinery. Marijuana first appeared in significant quantities on the Texas border just before World War I, sold over the counter in drugstores or by mail order. By the 1920s, West Indian and South American sailors were bringing it into New Orleans, joined by Mexican migrants. Black and Creole jazz musicians embraced the drug and carried it north to Chicago. One white clarinetist, Mesro, dubbed the Johnny Appleseed of weed, brought marijuana to New York City. By the 1930s, Harlem alone was home to an estimated 500 marijuana dealers. Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, made marijuana a moral panic, portraying it as a threat to youth and society. Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, effectively outlawing its use. The Narcotic Control Act of 1959 imposed harsh penalties. 2 years for a first possession offense, 5 for a second, 10 for a third. Selling brought at least 5 years for a first offense and 10 for selling to a minor. States followed suit with their own severe penalties. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 softened some of that rigidity, reducing simple possession to a misdemeanor and eliminating most mandatory minimum sentences. By then, marijuana use had become entwined with the cultural upheavals of the 1960s and was spreading rapidly. By the 1970s, marijuana was the most widely used illegal drug in the United States, cutting across class, race, and geography. In 1970, about 650 tons satisfied national demand. By 1977, consumption had ballooned to between 7,000 and 10,000 metric tons. Americans smoked an estimated 220,000 to nearly 400,000 pounds daily. Some sources put the figure even higher, at 131,000 pounds a day. Colombia and Mexico were the principal suppliers. In 1970, as much as 95% of US marijuana came from Mexico. By the late 1970s, 70 to 90% came from Colombia, which produced between 35,000 and 131,000 tons annually. About 70,000 pounds crossed into the United States each day. Jamaica supplied most of the remainder, with small amounts from Thailand and Africa. California and Hawaii produced 5 to 10% domestically. Law enforcement seizures reflected the surge. U.S. Customs seized just 5.1 tons of marijuana in 1965. In a 2-day stretch in 1978, agencies seized 47.5 tons in Florida alone. Street prices varied between $22 and $60 per ounce depending on quality, averaging about $50 to $60, roughly $600 per pound. By 1979, marijuana accounted for about 30% of all drug income in the United States, trailing only cocaine. The profits were enormous across the supply chain, except for the peasant farmers. Of the retail price, growers earned about 1%, Colombian middlemen 19%, and American distributors 80%. A pound bought from a farmer for $6 to $12 might be worth $600 on the US street. Large-scale marijuana smuggling operations were directed by well-organized traffickers in South America and the United States. Colombian organizations bought from local growers and stockpiled their harvests, often in warehouses on the Guajira Peninsula, before shipping them north by sea. Motherships carrying multi-ton loads loitered just beyond U.S. waters, where smaller vessels ferried cargo ashore, often landing along Florida's west coast between Key West and St. Petersburg. The distribution chain stretched from importers handling 25,000 to 50,000 pounds, down to street dealers moving ounces. Profits and insulation from law enforcement declined as one moved down the chain. Most consumers bought from dealers handling 4 pounds or less, often without any knowledge of the product's origins. The trade's sheer scale demanded widespread participation. Marijuana's bulk made it impossible for one group to dominate the flow. The drug's ubiquity and relatively low price, $50 to $60 per ounce compared to $2,200 for cocaine, lowered barriers to entry. Trafficking was seen as less stigmatized than heroin and easier to manage, often done among friends. Dealers were everywhere. Street kids selling nickel bags at stoplights, hotel doormen, cab drivers, students, lawyers, businessmen. A pound bought for $400 could yield $640 when sold by the ounce. Many sold simply to supply their own habits. Florida's proximity to Colombia, just 1,100 miles away, put it within reach of small planes and private boats. Independent smugglers could buy surplus aircraft like the C-54 for $15,000 and fly 2.5-ton loads into one of Florida's 250 airports. Sailboats, often stripped down to carry 3.5 tons of marijuana, joined larger cigarette boats, equipped with radar scanners and night vision scopes to evade authorities. Surplus ships rendezvoused with smaller boats offshore, transferring loads for the final run to shore. Independent smugglers could sell to main distributors for $115 per pound, or, with storage and manpower, wholesale at $215 to $315 per pound. Some tried to build their own distribution networks, but few succeeded beyond the wholesale level. Profits ranged from $80,000 to $160,000 per ton when selling wholesale, and up to $510,000 per ton when wholesaling independently. One of the most notorious smuggling outfits was the Black Tuna Gang, led by Robert Platshorn and Robert Meinster. Conceived in 1974, the organization brought in 35 loads, about 500 tons, worth $300 million wholesale in just 2 years, netting $500,000 a week. Using a used car dealership as a front, they employed 35 to 60 people, hired former commercial pilots to exploit gaps in radar coverage, and painted false waterlines on their boats to hide heavy loads. Supplies came from Pedro Davila, a Colombian kingpin. Federal agents broke the Black Tuna Gang in 1977 during Operation Banco, tracing their money through nearly 500,000 currency transaction reports. 12 defendants faced a 100-page indictment, and the trial ran 4 months. Platshorn and Meinster received 64 and 53-year sentences, respectively. The indictment even included charges of jury bribery, obstruction of justice, and a plot to assassinate the judge. Before the mid-1970s, the US marijuana market relied almost exclusively on Mexico. Fields, often just 1/3 of an acre, were hidden near forests and harvested by hand, then moved north by burro, truck, boat, or plane. By 1970, 95% of marijuana smugglers arrested at the US-Mexico border were under 30, most under 25. A kilogram bought in Mexico for $4 could sell in the US for 100 times that amount. Demand exploded, and operations grew more sophisticated, shifting from cars and buses to planes and pleasure craft. But two forces changed the market. Operation Trezo, launched in 1975, destroyed over 20,000 marijuana and opium fields by 1978, The use of the herbicide paraquat sparked fears of contaminated marijuana, driving consumers away from Mexican product. Traffickers began searching for alternative sources. Colombia emerged to fill the void. Between 1977 and 1978, Colombian exports rose roughly 26%, while Mexico's fell about 40%. Colombian marijuana retail value reached $11 to $17 billion, dwarfing Mexico's $2.5 to $4 billion. Florida customs seizures rose from £20,300 in 1975 to £840,500 in 1978. Mexican drug arrests dropped from 1,283 in 1975 to 1,283 in 1978, 1976 to 411 by 1979. Today, Mexico supplies less than 11% of the US market, mostly smuggled by air into California, Arizona, and Texas. Arizona's sparse population and 2,000 clandestine landing strips make it a favored corridor. Mexican groups such as the Samaniego Miraz and Tercero Lechuga organizations continue to smuggle multi-ton loads, often storing marijuana in warehouses along the border before moving it north. After Fidel Castro's rise in 1959 sent thousands of Cubans to South Florida, Cuban-American criminal networks began sourcing drugs from South America. Colombia emerged as a major cocaine supplier in the late 1960s and, by the mid-1970s, as the dominant marijuana source. Colombia's soil and climate allowed continuous harvests, particularly on the Guajira Peninsula, where 100,000 to 250,000 acres were under cultivation. About 10,000 farmers grew marijuana, supporting some 50,000 people. Organized groups bought from them at $6 to $12 per pound. 1 acre yielded 250 to 350 pounds. Some organizations even grew their own crops. In 1977, a 3,600-acre plantation with a £5 million crop was discovered. After purchase, marijuana was stored in Guajira warehouses, some holding up to £1 million, before being loaded onto clandestine airstrips. Buyers from the US, often Americans, inspected the product on site. For $1,200, a twin-engine plane could land, load 30-pound bales, and refuel, guarded by armed locals. Pedro Davila's organization epitomized Colombian operations. With political connections, his father a mayor, his uncle a governor, Davila offered his US customers safe access to the Simón Bolívar airport, complete with police and military protection. His group also supplied motherships to the Black Tuna Gang. Colombian organizations controlled most maritime smuggling, using 100-foot vessels carrying 50 tons or larger ships, holding 100 tons. 3 main sea routes threaded through the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti, the Yucatan Channel between Mexico and Cuba, and the Mona Passage between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, before fanning into the Gulf of Mexico, Florida, or the East Coast. Some motherships sailed as far as the West Coast. They often flew false flags, Panama, Venezuela, or Colombia itself, to complicate U.S. jurisdiction. US-based Cuban, Colombian, and American groups ran offloading operations, shuttling 1 to 2 ton loads ashore with shrimp boats and speedboats. Increasingly, traffickers used the Bahamas as a refueling and staging point, exploiting its lax enforcement. Colombians played a role in US distribution, but did not dominate it. The product's bulk and scale of demand made monopoly impossible. Still, Colombian networks flourished in cities with significant immigrant populations, including Miami, Los Angeles, and New York. Operation Grouper, launched in 1979, revealed the scope of Colombian operations. Undercover DEA agents set up an offloading service in the Bahamas, so successful they had to turn away clients. Over the course of the operation, they helped seize 30 vessels, 1.2 million pounds of marijuana, 2 airplanes, and $1 million in cash. A total of 174 people were indicted and 135 arrested. DEA Administrator Peter Benzinger said the 14 organizations targeted supplied 40% of U.S. marijuana. Yet, as always, others stepped in to fill the void. Cuban involvement in marijuana trafficking began in the early 1960s in South Florida, where Cuban groups controlled much of domestic distribution. As Colombian traffickers pushed into the cocaine trade, violent clashes erupted. Investigative reporter Henry Messick reported that the two sides eventually reached a peace. Cubans could still handle cocaine, but only if they bought from Colombians. Colombians and Anglos could still wholesale marijuana, but Cubans would control its movement north. One of the largest Cuban-run marijuana organizations was the Cecilia Falcon cartel, led by Alberto Cecilia Falcon. Based in San Diego, it moved multi-ton shipments from Mexico into the U.S. in the early 1970s, distributing nationwide. By 1973, tanker trucks carried 3 tons per load. A 1974 DEA raid seized 6 tons. Mexican police later found another 42 tons in an underground cache. Cecilia Falcon was arrested in 1975. By 1977, more than 1,600 people were linked to his conspiracy. La Cosa Nostra had its own history with marijuana. In 1938, Carlos Marcello, later boss of the New Orleans family, was jailed after agents broke up the city's largest marijuana ring. But by the 1960s, federal officials insisted LCN wasn't involved. Profits were too small and the trade too scattered. Mexico's accessibility meant too many competitors for a centralized syndicate to profit. That changed as Colombia replaced Mexico as the main supplier. Larger shipments and higher profits made marijuana more attractive to organized crime. Today, marijuana smuggling is one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises in the world. And the Mafia, alongside Colombian, Cuban, and Mexican syndicates, has moved decisively into the trade. By the late 1970s, marijuana had become the second largest illicit revenue stream in the United States, and South Florida its busiest gateway. Roughly 30% of the nation's supply came ashore there, and with it came La Cosa Nostra's attention. At least 17 LCN families and more than 100 identified members were living and operating in Florida, where drug revenues were estimated in the billions. West of the Mississippi, the traffic still leaned heavily on independents and Mexican syndicates, but in Florida, and increasingly up the Atlantic seaboard, the Mafia learned to plug itself into the green rush. What drew them in was less romance than arithmetic. Marijuana moved in bulk and in waves. Whoever controlled long-haul transport and early wholesale could skim enormous profits while staying a layer or two removed from street risk. LCN had what the trade rewarded: capital, discipline, access to ships and planes, and ready-made distribution channels in big cities. LCN's penetration into the marijuana market followed 3 well-worn paths it had already used in other rackets. Working alongside Latin crews. Since the early 1960s, Cuban, Colombian, and Mexican organizations had dominated the Caribbean and Gulf routes. In South Florida, LCN learned to cooperate rather than conquer, financing loads, buying tonnage from Colombian motherships, and letting Cuban offload teams handle the wet work along creeks and marinas. The money was green. The flag on the freighter didn't matter. Buying the house. In cities far from the docks, Mafia groups took over existing domestic distribution outfits. Independents, flush with cash but light on muscle, were vulnerable to offers and occasional kidnappings. Where entrenched Cuban and Colombian wholesalers were too strong to bully, LCN simply positioned itself above or beside them, funding and moving volume the independents could not, outspending the competition. Finally, LCN did what deep pockets do, purchased multi-ton lots and priced the small players out. With capital, it could absorb lost loads, bankroll the next, and keep a reliable river of product flowing to its own network. The result was not monopoly. The marijuana trade remained sprawling and opportunistic, but the Mafia's comparative advantage, organization, translated cleanly into profit. On a cold December day in 1976, a DC-6 dropped onto a rural Pennsylvania airstrip at Mount Pocono, its cavernous belly holding 8 tons of Colombian marijuana. Agents from Customs, DEA, and the state police were waiting. They arrested 5 men and seized cars, radios, and scanners, the tools of an airborne trucking company. Investigators labeled it the Pot Airline, a transportation venture allegedly financed by the Bonanno family under Carmine Galante. The reported stake, $500,000, expenses included, bought an end-to-end haul from South America directly into the Northeast market, bypassing Florida's crowded coastline. The point wasn't daring, it was logistics. Long-range aircraft could put bulk cargo within a short drive of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. LCN's calculation was simple: fewer handoffs, more control, bigger margin. 2 years later, the Colombo family pushed into shipping by sea. Prohibition all over again, as one veteran investigator put it. Freighters were bought or chartered in Colombian ports. Cargoes of up to 100 tons were routed toward the New England and mid-Atlantic coasts. At first, Colombo loads still used Florida mothership shuttles, and then trucks northbound on I-95. Soon enough, the family and its partners were working the offshore dance themselves along the northeast. A freighter hovering in international waters, smaller boats sprinting to dark coves, box trucks rolling before dawn. The attraction was obvious. East Coast demand was immense. Mafia waterfront ties offered cover, and the public image risk, grass for college kids, as one mob expert dryly observed, was gentler than heroin. By 1979, routes had hardened into a pie chart, roughly 60% by sea, 35% by air, and the remainder by land, mostly over the Mexican border. Sea remained king because tonnage loves steel hulls, and the Coast Guard could not be everywhere at once. Air was the most dynamic slice, especially after heightened patrols in the Caribbean pushed traffickers to innovate. A single interdiction campaign, Operation Stopgap, showed both the power and limits of pressure. Over 4 months in 1977 to 78, authorities grabbed more than £2 million and 40 ships. Traffickers reacted like water around a rock. They went around. Loads shifted to larger aircraft capable of flying straight from Colombia to the southwest, midwest, and northeast. More freighters bypassed Florida for the Gulf and New England, and crashes on clandestine airstrips along the southern border ticked up as low-flying pilots stretched fuel and luck to dodge radar. Once Florida grew hot, smugglers favored new beaches and bays. Long Island's proximity to New York's wholesale market made it irresistible. Maine offered 300 miles of jagged coastline and lenient statutes. Seizures from New York to Maine spiked in 1978 to 1979. At the other end of the map, New Orleans emerged as a Gulf hub. A single quarter in 1980 saw 3 times the previous year's total seizures, as crews steered away from Florida's crowded radars. The West Coast, while never the primary destination, had its moments. In 1980, San Francisco authorities seized 21 tons and 2 yachts, including, with almost novelistic symmetry, the former presidential yacht Potomac. Most arrestees were Southern Californians, several others were Colombian, a neat snapshot of the supply chain's hybrid nature. Colombians grew and shipped, Americans offloaded and distributed. Supply globalized. With Mexico's eradication efforts and the Paraquat scare depressing demand for its crop, Colombia became the dominant source. But entrepreneurs like vines found new trellises. Tie sticks reappeared after the Vietnam era. African nations south of the Sahara ceded export niches. Jamaica, briefly throttled by a joint crackdown in 1974, drifted back into the trade as the politics shifted. At home, a different branch of the market matured. By 1979, US fields were supplying perhaps 7% of consumption, 700 to 1,000 metric tons retailing in the billions. The drivers were taste and fear. Connoisseurs craved sinsemilla, without seeds, and mainstream users wanted to avoid herbicide-tainted imports. California led the domestic wave. Mendocino, Humboldt, Del Norte, Lake, Riverside, San Diego, county after county saw marijuana revenues wash through local economies. Farms were hidden in national forests, ringed with tripwires and sometimes men with rifles. After a single Humboldt raid in 1978, officers hauled away $5 million worth of plants. Most product stayed in state, but the scale was undeniable. Hawaii cultivated its own legend. Pakalolo, Kona gold, Puna butter, commanded 4 to 5 times the price of mainland weed, up to $2,500 a pound. By the late 1970s, it was the island's largest cash crop, a cottage industry shipping tens of tons to the mainland, unusually via commercial air, each year. The DEA set the objective plainly: stem the South American flow. Tactically, there were real wins. Multi-ton seizures became routine. Single cases took down entire fleets. Strategically, the needle barely moved. Best estimates put intercept rates at 5 to 10% of what actually landed. The traffickers, often better equipped than the agencies chasing them, ran their own intel nets, scanned police radios, and flew faster, farther vessels. Courts, meanwhile, clogged with marijuana cases, handed out probation more often than prison. Even convicted traffickers typically served modest terms. The economic logic was brutal. Even if 4 out of 5 loads were lost, a well-financed operation still turned a profit. Capital plus patience equaled resilience. Any plan that started at the source ran into Colombia's Guajira Peninsula, where wind-scoured deserts met airstrips and warehouses stacked with bales. Eradication collided with livelihood. Tens of thousands of farm families depended on the crop. When President Turbe pushed an aggressive campaign, soldiers first, then a new rural police corps, corruption and geography blunted the effort. Commanders faced bribes the size of annual budgets. Seizures made headlines. The trade adjusted its routes. The Paraquat debate laid bare the policy bind. After Congress barred US support for herbicide spraying abroad, critics argued production had surged and prices fallen. Supporters of the ban pointed to public health risks and practical limits. Strong winds and rough terrain made effective aerial spraying difficult, even if it were politically acceptable. A proposed dye additive to warn users never got beyond theory. From Bogotá's vantage point, the mixed messages from the north, lenient sentences, legal paraphernalia, made pleas for Colombian crackdowns ring hollow. For the Mafia, the marijuana era taught a few simple lessons. First, the sweet spot was still importer-wholesaler, maximum margin, minimum public profile. Second, partnership often paid better than conquest. The Latin organizations could deliver volume reliably, and buying from them was cheaper than building a parallel supply chain from scratch. Third, diversification mattered. With extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and construction already in the portfolio, drug profits could be plowed back into ships, planes, warehouses, and lawyers. The market remained far too large and unruly for any single group to own. But wherever tonnage needed capital, coordination, and quiet distribution, LCN could, and did, set up shop. Florida was the beachhead. The Northeast and Gulf became the thoroughfares, and the country's domestic gardens supplied its own high-end niche. The trade, like the plant, proved hard to contain. Cut it back in one field, and it sprouted in another. Squeeze one corridor and it spilled into the next bay. And in the shadows between supply and demand, the Mafia did what it had always done best: organize chaos into cash. After bookmaking, the real engine is numbered. A street lottery with $1 billion take, built for eastern and midwestern cities. The play is simple and ruthless. A collector, wired to the neighborhood, takes a 3-digit pick from 000 to 999, scribbled on a slip with cash. A pickup man moves the paper and money to a controller, handling several crews. The controller tallies, then sends the day's action to the bank, the nerve center. The winning number comes from a neutral daily figure: stock sales totals, pari-mutuel pools, anything published. The odds are 1,000 to 1. The average payoff is about 55 to 1. When one number gets heavy, the bank lays off to another outfit, just like bookmakers hedge a bad line. Numbers runs on paper. Bets, balances, payouts, every nickel recorded. Those records keep the business smooth, and when found, hand the cops a ready-made ledger. Lotteries are the cousin. Same bones, smaller body. Maybe $200 million wagered, $50 million net. Most action rides foreign drawings like the Irish sweepstakes. The pattern never changes: consideration, chance, prize. Bingo qualifies. So do punch boards and punch cards. Pay, poke a hole, or knock out a disc. Hope your slip hits. The plays exist, but they don't touch the sweepstakes in reach. Casinos are a different animal. Illegal rooms turn over about $110 million a year. They range from smoke-stained back rooms to what used to be plush clubs before the late 50s squeezed the velvet out. Legal houses make half their money on craps, a quarter on blackjack, the rest on roulette, slots, baccarat, and side action like poker. Illegals usually keep it to craps and blackjack, with a few machines humming in the corner. Machines are everywhere and in disguise. The classic one-arm bandit is still the backbone. Outside casinos, they're good for an illegal net of about $70 million on $400 million dropped. The take can run to half the handle. To dodge statutes, hustlers add a human operator to flip a switch, turn pinball into a cash-out via free game counters and reset buttons, or build electronic boxes with no moving parts, so the law can't call them mechanical. Who plays? Almost everybody. The exceptions are predictable and overlap. People over 65, the widowed, those under $5,000 income, no high school diploma, and members of Bible-focused fundamentalist sects. These groups fall below a 50% participation rate. Exposure matters. Grow up gambling or live near it, you play. Catholics and Jews gamble more than other groups. 4/5 of Northeasterners report some gambling, only about 2/5 of Southerners do. More geographic mobility, more military ties, more play. Problem players marry more, spend more on leisure, risk a bigger slice of household income, and take losses 8 to 15 times deeper relative to income than the general public. Personality tests show heavier gamblers chase risk and stimulation. They favor skill games and high interaction settings. By 1974, 61% of adults placed a money bet. Fewer than 13% kept it strictly among friends. Roughly 69 million Americans shoved about $87 billion into commercial games. 8 legal, racing, casinos, bingo, state lotteries, dog tracks, GILI, OTB, and 4 illegal, numbers, sports cards, horses, and sports with a bookie. Only 11% played an illegal game at all. Clientele split cleanly. Numbers players cluster in the Northeast, 8% of adults there versus 3% elsewhere. Skew non-white, black or Spanish-speaking, with Italians well represented. Their bet size rises with income to about $15,000, then flattens or dips. Almost all live within 75 miles of the 25 largest cities. Illegal sports bettors are white males, 18 to 44, northeastern or north central, some college, earning over $10,000. Sports cards give the less advantaged a way to speculate on games. Action is concentrated. Only 14% of bettors laid out more than $200 in a year. Half bet under $50. Average spend tells you where the juice is. Casinos around $448 per bettor. Horses, legal or illegal, about $590. Illegal sports roughly $623. Lotteries, $25. Bingo, $74. And numbers, $123, are smaller per head but massive in volume. Players rarely stick to one channel. The heaviest illegal bettors are also the biggest legal bettors and the most active among friends. Structures and psychologies pair up. State lottery complements numbers. Racetrack or legal OTB complements bookies. Legal casinos line up with illegal rooms. Why they play splits three ways. For some, it's recreation, light bettors and a chunk of sports players. For the high-stim crowd, it's the buzz. They want risk and a roll, prefer skill to pure chance, and act like small-time derivatives traders shut out of formal markets. Then there are the desperate. As James F. Guyot put it, when work won't pay, gambling looks like the only shot at a score. The state rolled out OTB in 1971 and promised $100 million a year to the city and a chokehold on street bookies within 5 years. 8 years later, neither happened. Bookmakers still worked the curb outside parlors, paying roughly 9% more than OTB ever could. OTB's handle slipped $13.8 million. Its payout to the city dropped $18.7 million to a 4-year low. Numbers stayed ingrained in the slums. Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, heavy among blacks and Puerto Ricans. Small-time independence is the polite theory. Facts cut both ways. In 1975, a jury convicted James Jimmy Knapp, Napoli Sr., and 8 others of running a $35 million a year policy and horse operation, largest in the nation. The same month, police grabbed 18 in a $50 million a year gambling ring tied to the Genovese family. Illegal casinos popped up too. Gamblers Anonymous guessed 50-plus active rooms. Albany flirted with legal casinos, then flinched. Organized crime fears, social costs, and shaky revenue forecasts kept the door shut. Legal slate, greyhounds, Jai Alai, OTB with New York races on live feed, state lottery, $650 million wagered legally each year. The illegal side was bigger, about $800 million in 1978, by the state's attorney's count. Organized crime took a cut of both. A Florida syndicate of whale bettors walked into the frontons, bet millions, dominated trifecta pools, and left with the cream thanks to inside information and special treatment. The bigger fear wasn't just edge play, it was laundering. The commission suspected stacks of dirty money being wagered and collected as clean winnings. A state study called the lottery a regressive tax that hit the poor without delivering promised education gains and recommended pulling the plug. The state's attorney said legal gambling didn't dent the illegal market. Only higher payouts and lower state take would compete. Nothing changed. Illegals moved where pressure was light. By 1976, numbers and sports banks shifted from Trenton to Bucks County, including a Falls Township spot grossing over $1 million a year, helped by New Jersey's tighter rules and Pennsylvania's new state lottery. The Morning Call called the lottery an unwitting partner to bookies. Lax enforcement and foggy guidelines let illegal shops rake an estimated $500 million in untaxed income. Using the state's 3-digit draw as the daily number gave numbers banks free publicity and credibility, while illegal payouts stayed higher. No taxes, low overhead, and no 1099s. Detroit and Flint brought the usual, numbers and policy games, plus racetracks tangled with syndicate money. In 1973, Detroit's police commissioner pointed straight at Hazel Park Racing Association, state-licensed monopoly turning roughly $1 billion a year, with former Mafia power in position to profit. Concerns ran from who got hired to which contractors got paid. By the late 60s, the Detroit mob was running the races at Hazel Park for profit and pocketing off-track betting gains. A clean license didn't guarantee clean ownership. In 1975, the Oklahoma City Times mapped a target. Independent gambling was thriving, estimates of a $60 million annual business, with public apathy. 95% don't care, said one bookmaker, and soft laws. Making book on sports was legal. Horse bets were a misdemeanor. Liens were the worst fallout most bookies feared. The biggest operator pulled $1.7 million a month before relocating to Las Vegas, leaving a wide-open market. Veterans warned that tighter laws without real enforcement just crush independence and invite a takeover. If there's money behind tightening Oklahoma laws, it's coming from La Cosa Nostra. Stiff laws drive out the independents so the syndicate can move in. A 1974 grand jury said the quiet part loud. Widespread illegal gambling across multiple counties, millions in wagers, much of it run by or allied with organized crime figures from New York and New Jersey, concentrated in the South. It found local illegal action everywhere, even crossing county lines, and said the industry thrived on public apathy, low law enforcement priority, and lifetime friendships between gamblers and officials. The tracks were the crown jewel. Legal racetracks doubled as prime illegal markets. The on-track bookie, shoulder to shoulder with track staff, served the whales. He extended credit, dodged wiretaps by staying off phones, saw odds and results first, and insulated his bettors. Big plays with him didn't move the tote. He could even use the betting windows as layoff outlets. Enforcement was a joke. In 1978, 4 men were assigned to police over 5,000 races a day statewide. Bookmaking was a misdemeanor on the track, a felony off it. The result, weak laws, low fines, and bad morale. The money was huge. On-track bookmaking likely exceeded the track's own handle. Bookies took each and every race, sports, anything else going on. A multi-million-dollar business with 2 rot problems attached: lost legal revenue and corruption. The grand jury called it a conspiracy that allowed the on-track bookmaker to flourish, with many denying or ignoring an obvious pattern. The rings looked national and layered, complex and well-organized with national connections, built to insulate their top men, and carried race-fixing allegations prevalent at a number of Florida's tracks. Cops warned against adding casinos. Major Stephen Bertuccelli told the U.S. Senate his department lacked the tools for legitimate business infiltration and cash flow tracing. He said it would take 5 years to understand casinos. By then, the infiltration would be set. He also blasted the stats game, mass arrests for headlines, while the hierarchy stayed untouched. Even when wiretaps documented $1.6 million in wagers, projections ballooned to a $44 billion annual gross for the bookies under investigation in Dade County alone. Absurd on its face, but a measure of how far the numbers got stretched. Judges weren't eager to punish. Dade County judges dismissed most of the 1,368 indictments returned by the first statewide grand jury. The Attorney General begged the appeals court to reverse the wholesale dismissals and lost. No state is more tied to gambling. Gaming taxes make up about 45% of the general fund. The industry is the largest employer, roughly 1/3 of the workforce. You can't turn that off without wrecking the economy. The intent to keep syndicates out has never fully matched reality. Hidden ownerships and skims bled casinos for decades. Meyer Lansky was indicted, never tried, for skimming $13 million from the Flamingo. The money never came back. Samuel Cohen and Morris Landsberg pled to tax and interstate gambling charges out of the same operation. In 1979, a federal grand jury indicted 6 tied to the Jolly Trolley for stealing and sending cash to secret New Jersey owners. Organized crime's influence has significantly reduced, but covert ownership keeps resurfacing. In 1966, the Chicago Sun-Times tied Caesar's Palace to Jerry Katina, Vincent Arlo, Ray Patriarca, major Chicago figures like Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana. $6 million skimmed in a year. St. Louis boss Anthony Giordano was convicted over hidden interests in the frontier. Alan Glick borrowed nearly $150 million from the Teamsters Pension Fund to build his casino footprint. Authorities believed his credit came with an underworld alliance. The Aladdin sold in 1979 under a sell or be closed order after a federal grand jury found underworld interests. Big names allegedly fronted as investors. Voters killed statewide casinos in 1974. Mob control was the fear. In 1976, they approved Atlantic City only. The governor signed with a warning: keep the undesirable elements out. 2 years later, the press reported the mob had planned for years, helped push the law through, and had a grip on casinos and the side money. A classic pattern of organized crime infiltration had begun. The Casino Control Commission was supposed to be the firewall. It stumbled. Its chairman said he didn't know his firm represented the Katina family. The FBI came calling, and the entire commission, except him, lost their jobs after a political corruption probe. A Canadian documentary said millions in underworld money flowed through Toronto into Atlantic City real estate. An investigation verified a $4.75 billion footprint, aided by an Atlantic City detective with access to organized crime files. Resorts International got a temporary license before a full check. 9 months later came allegations of ties to Lansky and bribery in the Bahamas. The company admitted 2 Gambino relatives stayed free, enjoyed comps, and lost substantial sums. Resort still got its permanent license. Caesar's World took loans from Al Malnick. Counsel suggested checking with justice on his ties to Cohen and Lansky. Management didn't. Malnick and Cohen reportedly pulled about $600,000 a year in interest. Asked if that bothered anyone, the company's president said only the business case mattered. The other side's profit wasn't their concern. He said they were trying to cut organized crime connections, but wouldn't commit financial suicide to do it. Caesars won a temporary license and grossed over $239 million before its permanent hearing surfaced the ties. Even a denial wouldn't necessarily close the doors. Pick a conservator, get approval, keep operating, pay owners a reasonable return. Cops and the public treat gambling like a nuisance unless it's in their face. Priorities follow complaints. Gambling is not high priority. Today, street crime is our priority, said a New York commander. Departments chase quantity, quick street busts, over quality, hierarchy cases. Assignments rotate to avoid corruption, which also kills expertise. Almost no one specializes. Less than 1% of police manpower and a similar share of prosecutors and courts' time goes to gambling. Chiefs still say they enforce to fight organized crime, but the top tiers aren't reachable off a numbers writer or a storefront bookie. The public feels the same split. Stop the nuisance, ignore the network. A big raid or expose stiffens spines, then attention drifts. Tighten the statutes without real enforcement and you get a perverse result. Small independents die. The syndicate moves in. That's the lesson from the street. Everywhere the action runs. Respect for the law dies when the law is a joke. After Newark burned in '67, Governor Hughes sent a committee to find out why. Their answer wasn't poetic. The black community didn't trust the cops. They saw corruption and they saw gambling laws ignored. That rot spread. Public social gambling is a perfect example. It's policed when it's loud or visible dice in a park, a card game that draws a crowd. That kind of disturbance standard hands officers enormous discretion. And because black gamblers are more likely to play in public, the dragnet finds them first. By 1974, blacks were 72.8% gambling arrests, but only 11% of the population. The reason wasn't race. It was visibility, street dice, sidewalk cards, numbers writing, more public than the quiet action whites ran behind doors. You can call that neutral. In effect, it's discriminatory. The National Commission saw the trap and said, dump the bans on private social gambling. Stop shaking down the most visible players. Go at the banks, the layoff joints, the connections, the businesses, and restore some credibility. On paper, the statutes are fine. Every state outlaws public gambling. Most outlaw private, commercial, and even social gambling. Syndicated gambling laws are on the books. When states run games, lotteries, jai-alai, tracks, off-track betting, casinos, they stack rules to protect the integrity of the house. But prevention means nothing without enforcement. Nevada proved it. A thick rule book didn't stop covert owners and skims. Federally, the toolkit has three parts. First, interstate bans, move gambling gear or use communications to run an illegal shop across state lines, and you're in federal territory. Second, taxes, pay the occupational and stamp taxes or get hit for the tax crime. Live large on paper-thin returns and you invite evasion charges. Third, the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 made big gambling its own federal offense. 5 or more people, $2,000 a day, 30 straight days, or a straight violation of state law. That lets the feds do the heavy lifting, investigate with their resources, indict in federal court, and convict using the state law you broke. All of it looks good in a brief. On the street, it barely stings. Light fines are an operating expense. Judges rarely jail serious gambling defendants. When they do, the terms are short. Nicholas Civella, Kansas City boss, got 42 months, the longest federal gambling term ever in that district. In 1977, Jimmy Napoli, policy ring said to gross $50 million a year, got 5 years and a $20,000 fine. Detroit's Louis Curie took 18 months and earned $10,000. Syracuse bookmaker Samuel Ibarra, a year and a day, his first time inside. One New York tally found 20 Gambino names in 39 cases over a decade, mostly gambling. 15 convictions, almost no prison. Fines, probation, early releases. If the mob shifted away from gambling in the 70s, it wasn't fear of punishment. It was margins and opportunity. Why the mercy? Judges and juries don't see gambling as serious. Court calendars are jammed. Plea bargains drive outcomes. Presentence reports are thin or missing, so nobody tells the judge the defendant is connected or a top earner. The commission said to fix that. Demand real presentence reports in gambling cases. Weigh the record and any ties to organized crime. When it's a major figure, impose real time and real fines. Some judges refuse to sentence the who rather than the what. If the conspiracy isn't nailed down, they ignore the whispers. Others won't hammer a defendant for running a game that looks a lot like the ones the state sells. Enforcement focus drifted. The 1968 Omnibus Crime Control Act opened the door to wiretaps, and from 1969 to 1974, the government hung 689 gambling taps, 71% of all taps. By 1981, it was 9 out of 106, sixth straight annual drop. The Attorney General stopped mentioning gambling in his annual priorities after 1978, pivoting labor racketeering, public corruption, legitimate business infiltration, and narcotics. The message was clear. For the feds, gambling slid off the front burner. That's a gift to multi-state outfits. Local cops don't have the reach or the gear to take down interstate banks and layoff hubs. Without federal backup, top-tier bookmakers stay insulated. The investigative playbook is known. Physical surveillance, informants and undercover, work every complaint. Electronic ears, flip the small fry with immunity to reach the bankers. Every page comes with a price. Surveillance costs time and bodies. The Scarpa case in Brooklyn, Colombo family, Regional Policy Center, took 21 months undercover. Michigan once cracked 58 numbers spots in one sweep. The biggest federal sports betting raid in history hit 26 cities in 1970, a joint FBI-IRS show through the National Council on Organized Crime. In Hawaii, more than 70 federal agents and 550 local cops ran raids. In 1980, New York and New Jersey hit 35 locations and took 44 men. These are choreography and logistics plus money. Informants are the workhorse. 95% of departments say it's their primary tool. But cultivated silence still matters, and a snitch might have his own angle, unpaid winnings, a beef with a boss. Undercover can work if the cop climbs. New York's Project Scotch tried to buy a Bronx disco, a Mafia watering hole. The target smelled heat, and the case died. A year later, Detective John Tult, embedded as a wire room recorder, earned trust, and after 19 months became a partner in a multi-million-dollar sports betting operation. His testimony mattered. That took time, bankroll, and acting chops. Citizens can light the fuse. In Queens, neighborhood complaints about a numbers racket led police to a grocery, a luncheonette, and a private club. $5 million a year, 20,000 bets a day. Without the locals, that bank stays invisible. Electronics tilt the field. No bookmaker of any consequence can operate without his telephone. Wiretaps are lethal when placed right. New Jersey's governor threatened to veto Atlantic City casinos without an extended wiretap law. From 68 to 74, 41% of cases with wire evidence ended in jail, usually 1 to 5 years. The rest ended in fines, probation, or dismissal. Martin Sklarov, a convicted gambler in Miami, said it plain. Federal wiretaps are going to put us out of business. Placement is everything. A bad bug gives you noise and subpoenas. The right way is laddering work. Orders that climb from writers to controllers to bankers, then spread sideways to the layoff. In one detailed case, DOJ penetrated vertically to the bank and then horizontally into the hedge. Operation Anvil in 1971 was the high water mark. Hundreds of bookmakers under electronic watch. Early estimates said illegal gambling ran $35 to $60 billion a year, with La Cosa Nostra holding about 40%. By 72, justice said they'd worked all worthwhile targets. The flood of cases clogged courts. Since then, surveillance waned. The official line was that Anvil did the job. The last tool is the oldest. Immunity for the little guys to nail the big ones. It has the same problems as informants, credibility and safety. But when it works, it works. Thomas Dewey made his name doing exactly that, cutting deals for small fry to put bosses like Charles Luciano in prison. Florida's statewide grand jury hands out immunity to minor players as policy. States that keep a permanent statewide grand jury and a strike force, pulling in multiple agencies, go farther, faster. The bottom line hasn't changed. If the law is enforced selectively, people stop believing it. If penalties don't bite, the business treats fines like a tip. If the feds stand down, the interstate money thrives. And if you chase street dice while the bankers count in the back room, you're not policing gambling, you're polishing its image.